The iPad Air 3 is kind of like the Toyota Camry of iPads. It's not a particularly mind-blowing or head-turning device, and it definitely doesn't sport the latest or highest end features or specs, especially considering it's already 2.5 years old. But one thing's for sure, it's solid, reliable, and will last you for many, many years to come. And so with this in mind, could you save a bit of cash by buying one of these second-hand for around $600 Australian instead of buying something new from Apple's current iPad lineup? Spoiler alert, probably not. But nonetheless, after using this tablet as my daily driver for the past 1.5 years, I'm going to be giving my thoughts on each aspect of the 2019 iPad Air 3 from a 2022 perspective, and why it's such bad value today when it was a cracker of a deal back in 2019. And by the way, if you'd like to see something specific, the timestamps are in the description below. So starting off like always with the design, the iPad Air 3 is really nothing we haven't seen before. Home button, bezels, rounded edges, there's really nothing outside the box. I mean, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, and honestly, it looks quite sleek, particularly in this very dark shade of space grey. But many would argue that it's too dated, considering that it actually shares the same look as the 10.5-inch iPad Pro from 2017, minus the camera bump. But the iPad Air 4 that came out in 2020 adopted the all-screen design, like on the most recent iPad Pros. One thing that stands out to me about the Air 3 though, is its perfect combination of bezels that are as small as possible while still retaining that home button, and honestly, the thin bezels help it feel so much more modern, compared to the cheaper and older iPad models that have the chunky bezels, and it makes all the difference between it feeling like it's from 2015 and having a relatively up-to-date appearance. So if you're a fan of the home button, but you also want as much screen real estate as possible, then this is pretty much as close as it gets. And speaking of the home button, we also get Touch ID as our form of security, and it's blazing fast. It immediately recognizes your fingerprint and unlocks the device. But the Air 3's main design feature is just how incredibly thin and light it is, and once you hold it for the first time, you'll be thunderstruck at how it almost seems to float in your hands, being very comfy and easy to grip. It's only 6.1mm thick and weighs 456 grams, so it's very portable. You know, you'll barely know it's there when carrying it in your hand or backpack. So for me as a student needing to move around a lot, that makes my life a million times easier. Now, despite sporting a very simple and slightly dated look, the Air 3 does sport a few handy features on the outside. For example, the smart connector, so you can hook up a keyboard and do things like type documents far more easily. Plus on top, there's a headphone jack, which will be really handy for anyone who isn't ready to move on to Bluetooth just yet. And as for the speakers on the bottom, well, they're not absolutely awful, but they wouldn't exactly be your go-to music listening setup. Plus, unlike on the iPad Pro 10.5-inch and the iPad Air 4, you've only got a dual speaker setup on the bottom, not two additional ones on the top for a more immersive stereo sound. I mean, it's not a big deal, but it's in areas like this that the Air 3 was watered down to separate it from the more expensive models. Speaking of areas where the Air 3 got watered down, let's take a look at the display. Now let's not get off on the wrong foot here. This is an excellent panel. It's razor sharp and definitely bright enough for most people, but it is missing one key feature that the 10.5-inch iPad Pro had, but I'll get to that in a second. It's a 10.5-inch LCD Retina display with a resolution of 2224 by 1668, along with a pixel density of 264 pixels per inch. For some perspective, that's the same pixel density, aka sharpness, as on the most recent iteration of the top-of-the-range iPad Pro. Plus again, the bezels don't get in the way of the viewing experience due to how subtle they are, so whether you're gaming, watching a movie, or browsing the web, it'll work just fine, no questions asked. Oh, and one other thing about this display is that it's compatible with the first generation Apple Pencil, which makes this iPad perfect for handwriting and drawing, and if you choose to pay the extra $100 for it, then it just gives your device so much more potential and functionality. I love the Apple Pencil, and since it's got pressure sensitivity and palm rejection, it's the closest you'll get to actually writing on paper. Personally, I use it every day in class for note-taking, and for maths, that requires writing out stuff by hand, which has transformed my senior high school life, as I no longer have to carry around a plethora of tons of separate notebooks because now all of my written notes and maths work is all on here in one convenient location. But with that being said, it is missing one major feature that the 10.5-inch iPad Pro had, and that is a ProMotion 120Hz refresh rate, compared to only 60Hz on here and on the following iPad Air 4. While it's not by any means an absolutely essential feature, it is a very noticeable difference, as the screen refreshing at twice the amount of times per second will allow for much smoother scrolling and swiping. Unfortunately, I can't show it on here since this video is only 30 frames per second, but oh boy, is it a buttery experience. Taking a step back though, you'll get by just fine without it, and the vast majority of consumers probably won't even care in the first place. In fact, some people can't even notice the difference to begin with, although it is definitely nice to have for those who do care about it. Oh, and you've also got the fact that this is an LCD panel, not OLED or mini LED, as seen on the iPad Pros and iPhones. In a nutshell, this means that you won't be getting those deep true blacks, as well as a better color spectrum. Again, not an essential feature, but worth noting. All in all, this display is very applaudable, although it's not absolutely top of the line due to the 60Hz refresh rate. Now, I don't know too many people who could care less about the camera quality on their iPad, but nonetheless, we're going to take a look at the lenses on here. The iPad Air 3 is equipped with an 8-megapixel rear camera and a 7-megapixel front-facing lens. And while these shooters are nothing special and can only really take average at best shots, both will work great for things like Zoom calls, considering our current situation, as well as quickly checking if you need to fix up your hair. Admittedly though, the cameras on much newer iPads, as well as the one on the 10.5-inch iPad Pro, are much better, as they have 12-megapixel rear sensors, as well as just overall higher quality. Moving on to video, the Air 3 can record in up to 1080p at 30 frames per second, so again, nothing special, plus many newer iPads can record in a completely overkill 4K at 60 FPS, which is just insane. I don't know why they would slap that onto an iPad, but the Air 3's video is enough for a tablet, and it'll get the job done just fine for things like FaceTime. Now, you may have noticed that I haven't really spoken too fondly of the iPad Air 3 up until this point. I mean, I haven't exactly bagged it, but I've said nicer things about other products. But all of that changes right now as we move on to the performance. The Air 3 boasts some very respectable and capable internals, consisting of the Apple A12 chipset, the same one used on the 2018 flagship iPhone, the XS, and 3GB of RAM. And so, surprise surprise, it'll handle anything and everything with great ease. High-resolution video editing, intensive games, running multiple apps at the same time, you name it, this tablet can run it. Despite the processor turning 4 as of this September, you really would not be able to tell. There's basically no lag, no glitching, and everything happens instantaneously. Now, before I get ahead of myself, I am going to note that yes, this is an older chipset, and so the most recent iPads like the Air 4 and the iPad Pros with M1 have enormously increased power by default. As you can see from these Geekbench scores, the Air 3 isn't exactly the best of the best anymore, but it's still very high-end, enough so that it'll fly through just about anything. So whether you just use your iPad to read the news or for your entire workload, rest assured that you won't have to worry about the performance for many years to come. In fact, due to Apple's great software optimization, you probably never will. Now, battery life on the Air 3 is something that's also held up pretty darn well. It's got a monstrous 11,560 mAh cell, and while my battery has degraded to around 90% over the year and a half I've owned it, according to Coconut Battery, I've never come across an instance where it didn't get me through the whole day, even on heavy use where I was running multiple apps at the same time or playing intensive games. In fact, when I don't have school and I'm just using it for trivial things like streaming YouTube and reading articles, it can go for days on end without needing a charge, and on the days where I forgot to charge it overnight and go to school with 50% battery, it still never fails to last until it's time to go home. Considering how thin this tablet is, combined with its age, I'm honestly shocked at how slowly the battery drains. Although, of course, the efficiency of the chipset and Apple's incredible software optimization do also have a part to play in this. But in a nutshell, I can assure you right now that the age of this tablet has had little to no effect on the battery life. And so, with every last detail, nook and cranny of the iPad Air 3 now out of the way, is it the right device for you? Well, considering that you can find them for around $500 to $700 on the used market, as Apple doesn't sell them anymore, it's a bit of a tricky situation in terms of getting the best value for your money. Now obviously, there's no doubt that the Air 3 is still a very premium and solid device, but for 99.9% of people, the value proposition just isn't there. For example, the 9th gen iPad can be bought new from Apple for $500 Australian, which is less than you'll find most iPad Air 3s for second hand. The iPad 9 sports a similar design, it's got the home button, plus it's got a slightly more powerful chipset, although the drawbacks are that it's got a thicker and less premium design, bigger bezels, and a non-laminated display, which means that it feels like you're touching just above the screen, not on it. But don't get me wrong, for 99% of consumers, the iPad 9 is absolutely a solid option with incredible value for what it is, and so I think that in the vast majority of cases, it would be a much better buy than a second-hand iPad Air 3. And to be completely honest, I think that the iPad Air 3 might just be the single worst value iPad of 2022. But if you can find a ripper of a deal, or you just like the better design and display of the Air 3, then by all means, go for it. And so with that being said, I think that pretty much concludes my review of the iPad Air 3 from a 2022 perspective. While this tablet didn't push anything forward, isn't a particularly head-turning device, and represents very poor value on the used market, it's still solid as a rock 2.5 years later, and if you're still using one, it'll serve you very well, and will continue to do so for the foreseeable future and more. If you enjoyed this video, or found it useful in any way, please make sure you drop me a like, and subscribe to TechSpree for more reviews, insights, and the occasional unboxing. Thank you so much for watching. This is Tom with TechSpree, and I'll see you as always next time.